Deep in the dense, uncharted woods of northern Maine, whispers of long-forgotten tragedies lingered beneath a canopy of towering pines and moss-covered branches. The forest had a reputation among locals, one marred by inexplicable disappearances and eerie sightings that defied logic. Though the stories were passed around in hushed tones at campfires and over cups of bitter coffee in roadside diners, no one dared venture deep enough to see if the legends were true. On a chill autumn evening, when twilight blurred the line between day and night, a small group of friends decided to test fate by venturing into the heart of these cursed woods. They were an odd mix: an investigative journalist seeking material for her next expose, a nature photographer chasing the perfect shot, and two amateur thrill seekers with a penchant for the paranormal. Their plan was simple: spend a night camping in the area where, according to local lore, the forest's dark secrets were most alive. The group set up camp near a clearing bordered by ancient trees that seemed to lean in conspiratorially. The air was heavy, saturated with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. As dusk turned into night, the forest awoke with sounds both mysterious and menacing: a distant rustling, the snap of twigs under unseen steps, and the occasional bone-chilling howl of an animal or something else entirely. Despite the mounting unease, the friends huddled around a flickering campfire. They shared old ghost stories, each tale more unnerving than the last, until the sound of a branch snapping nearby silenced them. At first, they assumed it was an animal, but when the snapping recurred in a rhythmic pattern, they felt a growing sense of dread. The journalist, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery, grabbed her camera and flashlight, and together they moved toward the noise. As they neared a thicket, the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The rustling grew louder until they found themselves in a small clearing encircled by ancient stone markers, half obscured by tangled ivy and the relentless grasp of nature. The stones were etched with symbols that defied translation, cryptic and ominous. In the center, a weathered journal lay abandoned on the ground. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with frantic scrawls and cryptic warnings. The journal recounted the harrowing experience of a man who had once lived in a secluded cabin deep in these very woods. He described how the forest, as if possessed by a vengeful spirit, would lure unsuspecting travelers to their doom. His last entry was a desperate plea for forgiveness, signed only with the initial M. The text hinted at an ancient, malevolent force residing among the trees, an entity that fed on the terror of its victims. A cold shiver ran down their spines as the implications sank in. Suddenly, the silence shattered with a guttural sound emanating from the darkness. The ground seemed to tremble as if an earthquake had passed beneath them. The photographer captured a fleeting shadow moving between the trees, a dark silhouette that defied explanation. In that moment, the group's fear turned palpable. They decided it was time to retreat to their camp. But as they hurried back along the path, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of indistinguishable trails and deceptive echoes. Every direction they turned revealed nothing but twisted roots and deceptive angles. The forest had become hostile, a living maze designed to disorient and trap its prey. The journalist's flashlight flickered sporadically, as if struggling against the oppressive darkness. In the distance, they could hear the soft murmur of a voice, low and mournful, reciting words that made their skin crawl. The words were unintelligible, yet somehow filled with an ancient sorrow and warning. As night deepened, the group's unity began to fray under the relentless pressure of isolation and dread. One of the thrill seekers, whose curiosity had always bordered on recklessness, insisted on following the disembodied voice. Against the protests of the others, he stepped off the path, his figure swallowed by the black void between the trees. Minutes stretched into hours, and the group's calls for him went unanswered. The forest, it seemed, had claimed another victim. Panic set in as they desperately attempted to retrace their steps. The sound of heavy breathing and rustling leaves accompanied them at every turn, as though the forest itself were stalking them. Shadows morphed into forms that resembled twisted human figures, their faces obscured by gnarled bark-like textures. At times, the friends could swear they saw eyes glinting in the dark, watching silently from the undergrowth. In a clearing near a dilapidated wooden cabin, the remaining group members stumbled upon a scene that was as disturbing as it was inexplicable. The cabin, long abandoned and overtaken by nature, bore fresh signs of occupation. Flickering candlelight spilled through the broken windows, and the remnants of recent fires still smoldered on the hearth. The walls were inscribed with desperate messages and symbols similar to those on the ancient stones they had found earlier. It was as if someone or something had been waiting for them. Inside, they discovered more journals, scattered on a rough-hewn table. Each one chronicled similar experiences of terror and hopelessness, written by different victims who had all encountered the same forest entity. The entries described a cyclical pattern of terror, as if the forest was cursed to repeat its tragedies over and over again. One entry detailed the harrowing moment when, cornered and alone, surrendered to the overwhelming dread and vanished without a trace. Another recounted a woman's frantic escape from an unseen force that chased her until she collapsed in a clearing, her memory shattered by the encounter. As the group absorbed these accounts, the wind outside rose to a haunting howl. The temperature dropped drastically, and an inexplicable fog began to seep through the cracks of the cabin, creeping slowly into every room. It carried with it the unmistakable stench of decay and something far more sinister, a metallic tang that hinted at spilled blood. The candle flame sputtered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls, making the inscribed symbols appear to writhe and pulsate. The photographer, ever the visual storyteller, tried to capture these bizarre phenomena with his camera, but his equipment malfunctioned repeatedly, as if cursed by the very forces that haunted the forest. In a final, desperate act, he recorded a short video that showed a glimpse of what might have been the source of the forest's malice. A pale, emaciated figure lurking at the edge of the cabin's doorway, its eyes reflecting a maddening hunger. The recording ended abruptly, leaving an eerie silence that was louder than any scream. Desperation took hold. The group resolved to leave the cabin and return to civilization, to escape the nightmare that the forest had woven around them. They gathered what few supplies they had and stepped back into the oppressive night. But as soon as they crossed the threshold of the clearing, the forest retaliated. The ground beneath their feet seemed to pulse, and the trees groaned with a sentient fury. It was as if the entire woodland had become a living entity, intent on ensnaring them within its endless grasp. They ran blindly, their only guide the faint memory of the path they had taken earlier. The forest, however, seemed determined to confound their every effort. Paths merged and split in unnatural ways, and every turn led them deeper into the labyrinth of despair. The fog thickened, muffling their footsteps and transforming the world into a monochrome nightmare where sound and movement played cruel tricks on the mind. Hours passed, or perhaps it was only minutes, when suddenly the forest opened into a small glade bathed in an eerie silver light. There, in the center of the glade, lay a circle of ancient stones, each inscribed with the same cryptic symbols they had seen before. The air vibrated with a palpable energy, and the ground trembled underfoot. In that moment, the group realized with a sinking dread that they were standing at the threshold of the forest's heart. As they hesitated, a figure emerged from the circle of stones, a spectral apparition, its form both human and not, draped in tattered shrouds that seemed to blend into the mist. The entity's eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and its voice resonated in the minds of the terrified travelers, filling them with centuries-old sorrow and malice. It spoke of a curse that had been laid upon the land, of a time when the forest was the battleground of ancient rivalries and bloodshed. It lamented the endless cycle of torment, binding every soul that strayed too far from safety into its unyielding grip. With each word, the apparition's form grew more defined, more desperate, as if it were reliving its own final moments over and over again. The entity reached out with a skeletal hand, beckoning them to join its eternal vigil. The forest trembled as a chorus of voices, half whispers and half sobs, filled the glade. The friends felt their will erode, as if the sorrow and terror of the past were seeping into their very souls. Summoning every ounce of strength, the journalist grabbed the journal from her pocket, the one that had first warned them, and clutched it tightly. With a cry that defied the crushing despair, she recited the desperate words from the page, a plea for mercy and liberation from the curse. For a fleeting moment, the forest stilled. The spectral figure paused, its eyes flickering with uncertainty. In that brief interlude, the fog receded and the oppressive energy lifted, as if the ancient spell was being unraveled. Seizing the opportunity, the group broke from the glade and sprinted into the night. The forest, however, was not ready to relinquish its prey so easily. The ground shifted, roots snaking out to trip and entangle them, while unseen forces clawed at their clothes and skin. The friends, propelled by sheer terror and the instinct to survive, pushed onward through the twisting paths. Every step was a battle against both the physical and the spectral elements of the cursed woods. Miraculously, after what felt like an eternity, the first hints of dawn began to pierce the horizon. Pale light crept over the treetops, and with it came a fragile sense of hope. The oppressive atmosphere began to lift as the natural rhythms of the forest reasserted themselves. The malevolent energy receded into the shadows, leaving behind only the lingering echoes of a nightmare that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. When they finally emerged from the forest's clutches onto a lonely, dew-soaked road, the survivors collapsed in exhausted relief. They looked back at the tree line, a dark, unyielding barrier that concealed its terrible secrets once more. The forest had claimed its due, a fragment of their souls, an indelible memory of horror, and in return, it had spared them a fate worse than death, the unending, pervasive terror of what they had witnessed. In the days that followed, the journalist's article became a sensation. A grim, meticulously detailed account of the forest's ancient curse and the unspeakable horrors hidden within its depths. But even as the world read about the nightmarish ordeal, those who had experienced the terror knew that the forest was no longer a story. It was a living nightmare, an eternal reminder that some places are cursed beyond redemption, where the past refuses to rest and the shadows hold unspeakable truths.
Story number 2.
A bitter wind howled through the broken windows of the abandoned manor as night fell like a shroud over the forsaken estate. For years, locals whispered that the mansion was cursed, a place where souls had been lost in the grip of unspeakable horror. Intrigued by the legends and driven by a desperate need for closure after a personal tragedy, Mara decided to confront the darkness that had haunted her dreams since childhood. Stepping through the creaking iron gate, Mara was immediately overwhelmed by the oppressive atmosphere. The once grand estate was now a decaying labyrinth of corridors and forgotten rooms, each echoing with the remnants of past anguish. The dim light of her lantern revealed dust-laden portraits, their subjects staring out with hollow eyes, as if silently pleading for release. The air was thick with the stench of mold and despair, every step releasing memories of suffering that seemed to permeate the very walls. As she ventured deeper into the manor, Mara found herself in a vast hall with a shattered chandelier hanging precariously above. The silence was nearly complete, broken only by the soft murmur of her own heartbeat and the distant creaks of the old building. In one corner, a grand piano, its keys yellowed with age, sat silently as though waiting for someone to play a final, sorrowful tune. Something about the room made Mara's skin crawl, a sensation that she was not alone, that unseen eyes were watching her every move. Drawn to a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness, Mara's curiosity won over her mounting dread. The stairs led to a subterranean wing that had once served as a sanctuary for those deemed unworthy by society. Now, the cold stone corridors were filled with remnants of a forgotten era, rusted medical instruments, faded restraints, and cryptic scribbles scrawled on the walls in desperate, uneven handwriting. With each step, the oppressive air seemed to thicken, as if the darkness itself were a living entity determined to suffocate any hope of escape. In the deepest part of the asylum, Mara discovered a sealed door behind a heavy iron gate. The door bore strange, archaic symbols that pulsed faintly in the lantern's glow. Driven by a mix of terror and resolve, she forced the gate open, her heart pounding in her ears. Beyond lay a small chamber that appeared to be a ritual room, a macabre altar at its center, stained with the remnants of long-forgotten rites. In the center of the altar was a weathered diary, its cover bound in cracked leather and etched with symbols identical to those on the door. With trembling hands, Mara opened the diary. Its pages told the harrowing story of Dr. Elias Marrow, a man whose descent into madness had been as swift as it was inevitable. The doctor had once been a respected physician in the manor's private clinic, but his obsession with transcending the boundaries of life and death led him down a forbidden path. According to the diary, he believed that by harnessing the suffering of his patients, he could open a portal to a realm beyond human comprehension, a realm where unspeakable horrors awaited, eager to devour the souls of the living. As Mara read, a sudden chill swept through the room. The lantern flickered, casting erratic shadows that danced across the walls like specters. In that moment, the air grew heavy with an almost palpable malice, and the sound of soft, sorrowful whispers filled the chamber. It was as if the very walls were recounting the agony of those who had perished here. The whispers grew louder, forming words in a language that was both ancient and disturbingly familiar, a language of grief and torment. Before Mara could react, the temperature plummeted and the diary slipped from her grasp, landing open on a page that detailed the final, desperate ritual of Dr. Marrow. The text described an incantation meant to bind the tortured souls to the mortal realm, a plea for salvation that instead unleashed the wrath of a vengeful spirit. The final lines were smeared with what looked like blood, the ink bleeding into the fibers of the paper in a grotesque mimicry of the doctor's unraveling sanity. A sudden crash echoed from behind her, and Mara spun around to find the door to the chamber had slammed shut. Panic surged through her as she raced toward it, only to discover that the iron gate was now rusted and immovable, as if decades of neglect had been compressed into moments. The chamber vibrated with an otherworldly energy, and the walls began to pulse as if they were alive. Shadows converged into the shape of a tall, gaunt figure, standing silently in the far corner. Its eyes glowed with an unearthly light, and its presence exuded a deep, primeval hunger. The figure moved with unnatural grace, gliding across the floor as it approached Mara. Every instinct screamed at her to run, yet she found herself rooted in terror. The spirit spoke in a voice that resonated both inside her mind and in the very marrow of her bones. It recounted the eternal anguish of those trapped by Dr. Marrow's unholy experiment, a litany of sorrow that had built into a crescendo of despair. It revealed that the doctor's ritual had not only failed to free the damned, but had instead tethered them forever to the manor, their souls doomed to wander its halls in search of release. Mara's mind raced as she desperately searched for an escape. She recalled a passage from the diary, a warning that had been buried beneath the frantic scribbles of Dr. Marrow's descent. It spoke of a counter-incantation, one that could sever the ties binding the spirits to the mortal plane. However, the words were fragmented, their meaning obscured by the ravages of time and the madness that had tainted every page. With a shaking voice, Mara began to recite the fragmented incantation, her words trembling in the oppressive darkness. The spirit's form wavered, its expression a mixture of agony and disbelief. The whispers in the chamber intensified, as if the very souls of the dead were rising in protest. The floor quaked beneath her feet, and a spectral wind tore through the room, scattering debris in a whirlwind of chaos. For a moment, it seemed as if the manor itself was caught in the throes of an ancient battle between salvation and damnation. In the midst of the turmoil, Mara felt a surge of determination. She clutched the diary tightly and continued the incantation, her voice growing steadier with each syllable. The ghostly figure recoiled, its eyes darkening with despair as the oppressive energy that bound it began to dissipate. The walls, once pulsing with malignant life, stilled and grew cold and lifeless. One by one, the tortured voices faded into silence, leaving behind an eerie calm that belied the devastation of the moments before. As the final echoes of her incantation died away, the spirit let out a mournful wail, a sound that was both a lament for lost souls and a dirge for the manor's cursed legacy. Slowly, the figure dissolved into motes of light that drifted upward, merging with the faint glow of a rising moon visible through the fractured ceiling. The heavy door creaked open, revealing a long, forgotten corridor bathed in the pale luminescence of dawn. Mara, heart still pounding with the residue of terror, stepped out of the chamber with the diary clutched to her chest. She ascended the staircase, leaving behind the malevolent echoes of the asylum, her every step a testament to the struggle between hope and despair. As the early light of day broke through the gloom, the manor's crumbling facade seemed to sigh with relief, a brief respite from the perpetual torment it had endured for decades. Yet, Mara knew that the horrors of the night were not truly vanquished, merely momentarily subdued by the fragile barrier between worlds. Weeks later, the diary found its way into the hands of those who sought to document the inexplicable phenomena that defied rational explanation. Mara's account, marked by both terror and a desperate resolve, became a somber reminder of the fine line between salvation and damnation. But every time the wind whispered through the dying trees surrounding the manor, those who had heard the tale shuddered, knowing that the House of Sorrow still harbored secrets far darker than the night itself.
Story number 3.
A dense fog clung to the ground as dusk surrendered to an oppressive, starless night. In the depths of an ancient forest known by locals as Hollow's Vale, a lone traveler named Adrian pressed forward, his every step muffled by layers of decaying leaves and damp earth. He had come seeking the truth behind whispered legends, a secret that had haunted his dreams since childhood. They said that in this forsaken wood, time, twisted, and unspeakable horrors were born from the sins of the past. Adrian had read countless accounts of Hollow's Vale, of travelers who vanished without a trace, of eyes that glowed like embers in the gloom, and of a presence that lurked between the gnarled trunks. Armed with only a battered journal and an unyielding determination, he ventured deeper into the wilderness, where the trees themselves seemed to whisper dark secrets. The forest canopy loomed overhead like a shroud, and every creak of a branch, every rustle in the underbrush, set his nerves on edge. As he navigated a narrow, winding trail, the path abruptly gave way to a clearing that felt both eerie and oddly familiar. In the center stood a circle of ancient, moss-covered stones, each etched with cryptic symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Adrian's pulse quickened as he recognized markings he had seen in old folklore, signs believed to be the seal of a ritual long forgotten. He crouched beside one of the stones and traced the incised lines with trembling fingers, feeling as if the stone were alive with malevolent energy. A sudden, piercing cry shattered the silence, echoing from somewhere deep within the forest. Adrian's heart hammered in his chest as he peered into the impenetrable darkness. There, between the trees, a pair of eyes, fiery and unblinking, seemed to watch his every move. The gaze was not human, yet it carried an intelligence filled with malice. A cold dread seeped into his bones, and he instinctively backed away from the clearing. But curiosity, that relentless tormentor, spurred him onward. As night deepened, the forest became a labyrinth of shadow and disorientation. The once clear path twisted unnaturally, and the familiar landmarks faded into obscurity. Every step brought him face to face with disconcerting sights. Fleeting silhouettes darting between the trunks, soft whispers that mimicked his own doubts, and a pervasive sensation of being hunted. At one point, he stumbled upon an abandoned campsite. A circle of charred remains and scattered personal belongings lay undisturbed, as if its occupants had been spirited away by an unseen force. The remnants of a hastily abandoned meal and a child's doll, its glassy eyes staring blankly into the night, painted a portrait of abrupt terror. Haunted by these signs, Adrian's mind raced. The journal he carried contained fragmented accounts of a secret gathering held centuries ago, an assembly of souls desperate to escape the clutches of a cursed entity bound to the land. They had performed a ritual beneath these very trees, sealing away their own torments in a pact with darkness. Yet something had gone horribly wrong. The ritual's power, instead of granting them deliverance, had awakened a primordial force that now ruled the forest with an iron grip of despair. Determined to understand the truth behind these chilling fragments, Adrian pressed on toward the heart of Hollow's Vale. The forest began to change. The air grew thick, almost viscous, and the natural chorus of nocturnal creatures was replaced by an oppressive silence that roiled with unspoken dread. In the distance, he spotted the faint outline of a decrepit structure, a chapel, its spires broken and windows darkened by years of neglect. It beckoned him with a grim certainty, as though it were the last remnant of hope amid a landscape of perpetual torment. Inside the chapel was a sanctuary of desolation. Dust motes danced in the feeble light that seeped through shattered, stained glass, casting kaleidoscopic patterns on the cracked stone floor. The altar, once a place of solemn prayer, was now draped in cobwebs and stained with what appeared to be ancient, dried blood. Adrian's footsteps echoed as he approached, each step resonating with the weight of centuries of sorrow. On the altar lay a weathered ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. With careful hands, he opened it, uncovering entries written in a spidery hand. They chronicled the ritual of binding, a desperate attempt to control the darkness that dwelled within the forest. The final entry, scrawled in haste, warned of a price too terrible to bear: the summoning of the Veiled One, a spectral figure said to be the embodiment of the forest's collective anguish. It recounted how, in a moment of unbridled desperation, the congregation had called forth this entity, sealing their fates along with their souls. The ledger's last words were a frantic plea: "Do not seek the truth, for it devours those who dare disturb its slumber." Before Adrian could absorb the full terror of these words, the temperature in the chapel plummeted. A sudden gust extinguished the lone candle he had lit, plunging him into suffocating darkness. A low, guttural murmur reverberated through the walls, as if the very building were speaking in a language of despair. Shadows coalesced in the corners of his vision, taking on forms that were both human and monstrous, a writhing mass of despair that slowly advanced toward him. In a desperate bid for escape, Adrian dashed toward the heavy wooden door, only to find it chained shut by an unseen force. Panic clawed at his throat as the whispers grew louder, swirling around him like a vortex of lamentation. Amid the chaos, he caught sight of a figure emerging from the darkness, a gaunt, spectral presence cloaked in tattered remnants of what might once have been priestly vestments. The figure's face was shrouded in shadow, but its eyes burned with an unnatural luminescence that cut through the darkness like twin blades. It spoke in a voice that resonated with ancient sorrow and fury, reciting verses that chilled Adrian to the core. The entity claimed to be the guardian of the forest's secrets, a warden tasked with ensuring that the sins of the past were never forgotten. With each word, the spectral figure's form grew more distinct, and the air around them seemed to vibrate with the weight of innumerable lost souls. Adrian's heart pounded as he realized that he was standing at the threshold of a truth that no mortal was meant to comprehend. Summoning all his courage, he reached into his coat and retrieved a small, tarnished locket, the only heirloom from his family, rumored to have once belonged to someone who had faced similar darkness. The locket, cold to the touch, vibrated with a strange energy as he clutched it tightly. In that moment, a sudden flash of insight struck him. The locket might be the key to appeasing the tormented spirit, a relic imbued with the power of forgiveness and remembrance. With trembling lips, Adrian began to recite a prayer his grandmother had taught him, a prayer of absolution meant to bridge the mortal realm and the spirit world. As his voice echoed through the chapel, the spectral figure recoiled, its eyes widening in what could only be described as anguish. The oppressive atmosphere began to wane, replaced by a fragile calm that seemed almost tangible. The chains that bound the door rattled and then shattered into splinters, as if the very fabric of the curse was fraying at the edges. In that fragile moment of hope, the guardian's form wavered, and the tormented faces of the lost souls that had once swirled around the chapel faded into sorrowful silence. The spectral figure bowed its head, a silent acknowledgement of the reprieve offered by Adrian's act of remembrance. Yet, even as the oppressive force began to dissipate, the echoes of despair lingered like a stubborn mist, a reminder that some wounds run deep, and some horrors can never be entirely banished. Adrian stepped through the now open doorway, his body trembling with the aftermath of terror and relief. The forest outside was transformed by the faint light of dawn, its malevolent shadows retreating into the recesses of memory. Yet he knew that the darkness was not truly defeated, merely held at bay by the strength of remembrance and the courage of a solitary soul who dared confront the unfathomable. As he made his way back along the winding trail, the whispers of Hollow's Vale followed him, a constant, spectral reminder of the night he had brushed against the edge of eternity. The locket, still warm in his hand, served as a bittersweet memento of the price of truth and the fragile boundary between redemption and damnation. Though the forest gradually yielded to the light, Adrian would forever carry the scars of that night, a testament to the enduring power of the darkness that dwells in the forgotten corners of our world.